Hey, hello everyone to one more week of the AWS Pulse. I am so excited about this week because we're going to talk about the role of the architect and where we're going. I'm Rafael. Nice to see everyone back here again. And I'm joined this week by my amazing co-host, John Walker, and our amazing guest, Randy, who is a senior principal solutions architect at AWS. I'll start with this, Randy. Like we typically like to know our guests. Can you walk us through what does a journey to become a senior principal solutions architect look like? Like what path did you take and what does that role mean today for AWS and for us?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. Great to be with everyone today. So it's interesting, when I hired in about 8 years ago, there was actually very few principal solution architects. And as the company and the organization grew, we ended up having more of those. Today, there's relatively few senior principal solutions architects. So in the group that I work in, there's 3 of us in North America, and we all got promoted at the same time. And what I really remember is kind of a funny thing. One of the managers, after the promotion came through, sent me a nice little gift in the mail and said, "Hey, congratulations, and like expectations are skyrocketing." I go, "Oh, this is really nice." And I turned the card over. I'm like, "Well, maybe there's some like guidance. What should I do now?" And the other side was blank. So I just mentioned that because there's a fair amount of ambiguity in the role. So my path, I started out covering one of our enterprise customers for about 3 years. And after that, I moved on to kind of a new role where I was working across a district of 4 separate districts of enterprise customers, some in the Colorado and the Rocky Mountain area, and then some in the Pacific Northwest. And so that gave me a little bit more scope and exposure to work across more customers. And then when I think what really helped me with my promotion was really 3 things. So one, having some success with customers, working on some big complex projects. Specifically for me, it was things like data lake migrations and working on some interesting machine learning things. The second piece was trying to establish myself as kind of a thought leader and subject matter expert, particularly in the data and ML world. And that involved some public speaking, wrote a book along the way, things like that. And then the third piece was, showing some impact on the rest of the AWS solution architecture organization. So working with our engineering teams, helping to evolve the role of what a principal solution architect looks like. So I will say my other 2 peers that were promoted at the same time had probably different pathways. There wasn't really necessarily a single common recipe. But I think what's interesting is you get promoted and you realize, since there's so few of us, there wasn't really a clear example of, well, this is what you should do now. And we each had to, kind of go and figure that out on our own.
So choose your own mentor, Randy. That sounds like a fun way to go. Fun way to go about it. It is ambiguity all the way down. I can echo that sentiment. Whenever I got promoted into principal here, I've been here, almost 5 years, not quite the 8 that you've got, but there was a lot of ambiguity. It's like, well, what's next? Well, John, you go show impact. Go try to define the thing that's next for you and where you're going to fit in best. So I echo that sentiment. It really does make it so that there's a lot that you can do, but because you've got a playing field that's so wide open, you've really got to be wise about which shots you call. So Rafael, you were going to say, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, there's ambiguity at pretty much a lot of the lower levels on AWS too. I can only imagine what type of ambiguity that shows up at the senior principal level. I mean, honestly, in the landscape right now is becoming ever more uncertain, right? Like there's this AI thing coming on, and the role is changing for everybody. It's changing for senior solutions architect. It's changing for associate solutions architect. Probably even more. I don't know, but yeah, I mean it's certainly to a level where you're helping define what that is going to look like for every level below. Part of your goals and your role as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think we all try to lead by example, showing patterns of this is how we approach complex projects or, big complex opportunities, things like that. And, also just mentoring about exactly what John was talking about, how to prioritize, how to make sure you stay focused. Yeah, I mean, in this world of AI, I think we've all been, I mean, I think everybody who works in and around any kind of knowledge, and particularly in tech, we're all wondering how is our job going to be different a few years down the road. And we realize, we kind of have to figure that out pretty sooner rather than later. So, yeah, myself and my two colleagues, Andrew and Tarek, we have been thinking and talking a lot about, what this really means for changing the day-to-day work of, everybody, associate, SA, senior principal. At the senior principal level, is dealing with that. Also trying to figure out just more broadly what's the right way to take our AWS Gen AI and agent portfolio to customers, trying to figure out the strategy of how we approach that. Being able to communicate that effectively. Those are some of the things we've been working on too.
Randy, you mentioned so you and I got a chance to geek out a little bit back, and you were relaying to me a workshop that you were at, and you mentioned that more than half of the folks that were there that showed up for an agentic development workshop didn't even have the agentic IDE installed yet. So it seems like we are at a point of crisis, that there is something about the state of our profession that seems like it's showing cracks. And what is that you're observing? And what do you think that we need to be doing differently? What is it that Andrew and Tarek and yourself are seeing?
It's interesting because before AWS, I was working at a company in the OpenStack space. Actually, I dabbled in private cloud before I moved over to public cloud. But I remember one of the customers I was working with, they had a whole team of enterprise system architects who produced a lot of paper designs, but never really produced working code. And I thought to myself, I don't really like that pattern. How do you know something's going to work unless you try it? Now, I'm not talking about.
We used to call them the ivory tower architects. They would kind of levitate there, right? Yeah, and not really do the building. Yeah.
And so I always like to be able to just try things, not produce production level code. That's a whole different job, but at least, see that the things fit together the way you think they do. And so what I really liked about AWS, the solution architect role here, we always call ourselves builder. That's the first thing we describe ourselves as. And I really think it's an important part of our job is, obviously we're not writing production code anymore. Some of us used to, but we still get hands-on enough that we kind of deeply understand the technology. And that is really the fundamental hallmark of our technical credibility in front of the customers we work with. And so, yeah, I was really surprised. I actually, that stat was kind of relayed to me from one of the people who was running the workshop. It was teaching people how to use some of the new AI coding tools. And I was just thinking to myself, we have, over half of the solution architects in the room don't have an IDE installed and don't have, any AI coding tool installed. And I'm thinking to myself, it must be really hard to do the job. If you're not able to build things, even on our onboarding cycle, we make people produce a demo, and I guess maybe they're just doing it by clicking through the console. But it was kind of an eye opener for me, to be honest.
Yeah, having that old-fashioned IDE too, and thinking that that's still the way is one of those antithetical thoughts, like coming in and just really having to have that conversation. For me, man, I keep CLI open constantly, usually several tabs running different agent tasks consistently across my workday. I started to use QuickSuite on a daily basis since it came out a couple of Wednesdays back. We had a good conversation with Shrikant Baheti last week 2 weeks ago about it. And, Kiro's really changed a lot of how I do this development, especially that spec-driven approach. And I don't say that just to tout our own tools, but more so to say that my job's changed. Staying in the role of a solution architect, I remember I'd have a docs tab open. I would have Visual Studio Code open to be able to go try something out. And I would have one of the base workshops open. So it used to be a different way, like having to go do it the more manual way. And now I'm using a lot of agentic stuff during that work. So
I think all of us started doing that. Right? There's certainly, like for me, I use a slightly different set of tools. I have a personal subscription to Claude AI, and I use Claude Code connected to Bedrock. Part of that is I like to use the tools that I hear customers talking about, just so I'm kind of familiar with it. But Yeah, I think all of us just embraced it. It's such a time savings, if nothing else, of being able to look things up more quickly, just do quick research on competitive trends or things like that. I don't know anybody that's not using these tools, at least to some extent.
So go ahead, Rafael.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I was just gonna say. I mean, I'm sure there's different ways people learn. I personally learn a lot faster, and it fixes more with me if I'm doing it right. Like, so if I'm going to do a conversation, or I'm going to have a conversation with a customer about whatever product, I don't have another way myself personally to learn without building it. And having an IDE is the only way to build some stuff. Like, I don't know, like, but again, I appreciate that everybody learns in different ways, but I feel like it's what you said, Randy. It's a very hard role to perform on if you are not doing it like in a practical way.
And it's hard. I mean, it definitely takes a lot of focus and attention, right? It's very easy to get caught up in the day to day, and you start living in presentations and things like that, and you really have to force yourself to stay hands on. Myself and Andrew and Tarek, we're all crank out code of varying quality on a pretty regular basis, and if nothing else, I have two kids at home that are, one's in junior high, the other's in high school, and they're using this stuff all the time in school. Like, I've got to keep on top of it for that, if nothing else.
Yeah. How else do you teach them how to do the science fair projects, right? You've got to teach them how to get down into the code a little bit. Yeah. So if you said something in the same line, so on the same topic, if you haven't put your hands on it, you don't know it, and you can't speak from authority. I think that kind of sums it up. Like, being able to, there's two pieces, right? There's one where we're building new things out of new materials. So those primitives have really changed about what we're creating with architecture. Agentic AI inside of the code that we're creating, crafting, designing, and teaching our customers to do, that's one side of it. Like, if you're a carpenter, what you're building the building out of has changed. The other side, the tools you're showing up to the job with, those have changed too. So you can't just show up with the same old hammer, saw, and screwdriver. You've got to go figure out this brand new set of tools that's got all the AI goodies in it.
Yeah. And, I think, to be fair, like a lot of folks in our organization have, really stepped up to the plate. There's this whole terminology of AI DLC, is AI driven development lifecycle, right? And it's a pretty interesting white paper to read. I mean, it's not really about the tools. It's really about how everything, like how agile product methodology is changing. Like the 2-week Scrum cycle probably doesn't make sense anymore when we can get things done so much more quickly. But it also does cover the fact that, hey, like, just rapid prototyping is going to be much more common. And I see quite a few of my colleagues show up, and they'll take down some basic requirements at the start of a workshop or a meeting or something, and they'll come back, at the end of the day with a pretty good working demo. So that's definitely the direction we want to go in.
So speaking of direction we want to go in, I don't know if you've seen any other episodes of the AWS Pulse, but I try to ask controversial questions, and it's kind of like a thing we try to do. And I'll just point blank ask, like, with where things are going and the AI and everything, are we going to have a job in the future? Like, is architect still going to be a thing? Or are we all going to have to go do something else?
I think we're all asking that, right? Every sector of the economy is asking, how is AI going to affect us? Is my job still going to be around? Is it going to be the same? And I think the software engineering community was probably the first to really grapple with this question, because they've been, like, they're very early adopters, and they're already seeing impacts of, we probably don't need people to write as much code as we used to. I think from the solution architect, now I will say the software engineers, I think, like, even the AWS, our high level leaderships will say, like, I don't think we're going to have less software engineers. They're probably just going to do different things. And we may have a different mix of, seniority, senior versus junior engineers, things like that. So I think in the solution architect org, you have to think about what's the value we really offered, right? Customers may be facing a complex technical landscape. They do want some expert assistance. And it's hard to imagine AI, even really good AI, completely replacing that. But it does mean, again, we have to have the technical credibility, as well as, honestly, some of the soft skills and people skills of understanding the landscape. I think there's an analogy. There was a really interesting article, actually two of them recently, that were kind of talking about how some large language models today, with some light fine tuning, are actually really good at making medical diagnoses. And that's being studied really carefully for obvious reasons, but the results are impressive. But it's not necessarily that we need less doctors, but maybe we don't need doctors to do the frontline diagnosis anymore. I mean, what they found is that giving the LLM the right context of the patient history and the test results was the most important thing as to whether the LLM would get the answer right or not. And so in some sense, you need doctors that know how to drive the tool. And then, the models do get it wrong sometimes. So you have to have an experienced doctor to kind of give a sanity check at the end. I think we're going to see that kind of pattern apply. Now, maybe some of the basic things that we used to do, like we used to run a lot of workshops for customers just to teach them about cloud. Maybe we don't need to do as much of that anymore because they can just go to their favorite AI tool and get the answers they want. But building things quickly, being able to understand requirements and context and figure out, how to drive the coding tool, that's probably still going to be a big part of our job. And then again, doing the final sanity check of is the output we're getting really makes sense. So I think it's hard to know for sure, but I don't think I see a world where we're not going to need people with, kind of the skill set we bring to bear. It's just hopefully we're going to be able to focus on the things that are more important and frankly, a little bit more fun. I mean, building things is more fun than delivering canned workshops anyway. So.
Yeah, I mean, on this piece, it reminds me of a story. There was Garry Kasparov, right, chess grandmaster in the 90s, famously went up against IBM's Deep Blue and lost, right? So an AI beat a human that was very good at something that was a very strategic sort of a mindset game. And at that same time, we were having the same conversation in the late 90s that we're having right now. And so what ended up happening was Kasparov created a chess tournament, right? And he would pit chess grandmasters against, these supercomputers. And at the same time, there was this third kind that could enter, which was a regular but ranked chess player that also had a laptop from the 90s that had an okay, chess game on it. And consistently, the people who were the combo of the AI chess game plus the human, so that laptop and ranked chess player, it's called a Centaur. They called it Centaur chess. That's the one that ended up winning. So what do you think about that component and how we can take the lessons learned there and move them forward into, how to actually move into the future with AI as a companion?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this idea of being AI enabled that we should all be thinking about. And it started out a couple of years ago of just, hey, are you using the tools to just be more productive at your day to day, which I think a lot of us have embraced. Probably now it's also about thinking, how are there certain things that I should just lean on the AI for, but where are the things I really need to concentrate on driving the AI well? So I think that idea of being AI enabled is probably what you're getting at. And I agree, it's really important. And there's actually some hard data to back this up, which is, we're kind of early in this cycle. It's kind of refreshing to see hard data, but people have been looking at like real impact on the job markets, and they are seeing things like, there's not as many junior software engineers being hired in some cases. Now, correlation doesn't always equal causation. Maybe there's other things going on in the economy, but there was a data point that showed that people who are AI enabled in some way are actually doing better in the job market than those who are not. And that's not just folks in tech roles, that's kind of broadly across a bunch of different sectors. So I think that is a promising signal for us.
I think so too. I think it means that it's not just our role, it's really everyone's role whenever we get down to it, that is going to be impacted in some way. And looking at ways to bring that AI together with that role and reimagine what that role can be. I don't see how this ends without all roads leading back to a technical designer needing to go back and help each of those, the people who are responsible for designing that role inside of that organization to have to come back and do that design and add the AI component that goes along with that person. So it seems like those roads stop at the CTO's office or at the architect's desk or whoever has that role right now. They're going to have to go find that component that goes along with that person and pair them together.
Yeah. Well, no, it's right. I mean, a lot of this is not just about, we probably think too much about how this is affecting us individually, but you do have to think about how it's affecting the team as well. So I heard a really good podcast with some of the folks from Anthropic who actually wrote Claude code. And it was a product manager and one of the software engineers. And they were really just talking about the way that they work as an engineering, as an agile team has really changed. Everything, some of it's kind of obvious, right? Like you don't need to necessarily write a PRD and wait 2 weeks and come back and see a demo. It's like the product manager slacks an idea over and 2 hours later, she sees like a working demo, like a rough mock-up. And so it just shortens the iteration cycles. But yeah, I mean, I think the senior leadership levels, everybody should be thinking about how teams are changing. In AWS, our kind of vanilla example of how we work with a customer is we have an account team. There's a salesperson, a solution architect, folks from support, specialists, and that's probably going to change. We have a lot of specialists right now who are great, really 400 level subject matter experts, but now every solution architect has access to AI tools to help educate them really quickly and get up to speed. So maybe we don't have to lean on, bringing in outside outside consultants to help us as much.
Let me get some perspective from both of you, because I'll keep hearing, and we will always keep hearing stuff like from the outside that says AI is going to replace us all, or it's not. And there's a comment that came on LinkedIn. I'll put it on the screen for us, right? So, and we'll keep hearing stuff like this. So I want to hear both of your perspective on this. What would you respond to this? I'm interested to hear.
Well, for one thing, I think it's just too early to know, because you hear these radically different forecasts. One day you have the CEO of One Frontier Lab says that, hey, what if in 5 years we have, I forget the numbers, or something like we have 20% growth in the economy every year, but also 20% unemployment. Like that would be a shocking impact. I mean, that like society really, unemployment rates in the double digits, let alone 20%, is something that we very rarely see. Other people are like, no, I'm really not seeing it yet. So I don't think we really know for sure. But again, you do realize that, or you do look at the examples of what we're just seeing today. And, there are some jobs that are changing pretty significantly, but, at the moment, nobody's really concluding that we don't need software engineers, for example. It's just maybe we need them with a different skill set or a different mix of levels, and the things they're doing day to day are different.
Yeah, I mean, you see some posts on LinkedIn, especially on LinkedIn, with people claiming absurd stuff just for engagement, but like there's no data to it for sure. Yeah, one other. Sorry, John, do you want to?
Yeah, I do. I love Paul's comment here, and I love it because it's provocative. We like the provocative question on this show, right? So I think it's kind of the question that's spurring all of us to ask ourselves, and then it's also what's given us a kick in the pants to change what we're doing. I don't think humans are stupid. I think humans are one of the most adaptable creatures on the planet. We're on all 7 continents and also in space, neener to the rest of the species. I think we're going to see something really phenomenal come out of what this is whenever you start to put the combination of something that is really commoditized cognition, right? That you can put this into different parts and components of architectures, different pieces of software systems, and even on the day-to-day activities that any human being would go take. But at the end of the day, we still have to have humans in the mix because we're still human. We're still going to be here in the end. I think if you look at this from a survivability, perspective of the AI doesn't survive if it's not useful to the humans, right? And likewise, the human's going to have to adapt just like we always have. The role as it exists now is not going to be what the role is 2-3 years from now. So something that's going to have this exponential curve for being able to take off in a particular dimension, granted, it's not doing that in all dimensions. It's just some of the dimensions of what a human being can do. I think that is fascinating. And how we plug that into our day-to-day lives, I can't wait to see what it is, but I also can't wait to shape it. I'm, in a way, both frightened and extremely excited to go put this thing together. What you have to remember, Sammy, is that we're not putting clay into a mold and letting it shape itself. we're shaping the clay and then firing the mold. Every single time we build an LLM, every single time we build a tool, every single time we design the next thing. And so I don't see humans going down the path that exempts humans from being in the mix. It's just, we're the potter whenever we're talking about the clay here.
I think it's interesting to note that for every kind of very gloom and doom forecast about what AI is going to mean for jobs, there's an equal amount of very optimistic forecasts. I mean, one interesting way to think about this is that AI maybe just lifts a really crucial supply constraint we have in the economy right now. So I grew up in Detroit, and when the car companies largely automated their factories over, I don't know, 50s, 60s, 70s, that time frame, like you obviously didn't need as many people working in the factories anymore, but you're thinking, well, could we have the same amount of people and just build more cars? And like, well, no, because fundamentally, like the demand curve is relatively fixed for automobiles.
Yep.
And you can't just make an arbitrarily like more or higher volume of them. But with knowledge work, what if we could, with the same number of people, just produce fundamentally more knowledge outputs? And a lot of times, like there's kind of a unknown large, possible shift in the demand curve that would respond to that. So maybe that's a slightly different way of looking at it from an economic point of view. For example, I did hear one very respected person say, well, maybe we're just going to write a heck of a lot more software with the same number of software engineers, and the world has shown no shortage of demand for more software. So
that's absolutely, I agree with that sentiment, because whenever you take the intellectual property of a company, which is really, in software and tech companies, that's where the value comes from, just like improving your house with a brand new roof, and the intellectual property goes from this to this much value. You go from softball to basketball size. All the other pieces that go around that property increase as well, like the salespeople that actually talk to humans, the HR, the finance, the marketing, the rest of the company that actually supports that interface. I wrote in comments, the P doom. We're really talking about that probability of doom versus, this optimistic approach, this optimistic path. So I think that you're right. Like there doesn't seem like there is a limit on the appetite for software yet. We've not seen that, curve really come off of the other side of it.
There's some other good questions on the chat. I might come back to them later. I just want to progress this forward. And to do that, like there's one thing that Pranjit said. So he asked, how can the solutions architect evolve, right? From right now, like designing systems that respond to user requests, to creating systems that can interpret intent and proactively solve high-level business problems. Like I'll let you take a shot at this, you both, but I think this is what we already supposed to be doing, isn't it? Like or in a way.
Well, a lot of the conversation around agents in particular, right? Because the first generation of Gen AI applications were pretty straightforward. Chatbots connected to data, natural language queries, BI over BI systems, things like that. Agents kind of really open up the door because they have this idea of a planning step where they can figure out how to solve a problem that is arbitrarily complex and ambiguous. Now, some agents are much more structured, and they're just they're filling in the gaps where existing processes may not have been perfectly automated in the past, or people were dealing with exceptions. But there are some kind of net new use cases where agents can reason and figure out how to solve really complicated problems. Like a deep research agent for the web, think about the just unknown variety of queries it has to be able to interpret and plan how to respond to. Or you see in the life sciences space, people using agents to better research and look at possibilities for prescription drug therapies and things like that. So anyway, I mentioned that because part of planning how to build an agentic system is figuring out what's that planning and orchestration step. And the thing that's really different about that compared to traditional business process automation is that it can deal with ambiguity. So it does change the interface point, whether it's person to system or system to system, from like very well structured deterministic API contract to now we can kind of interpret language and try to suss out the meaning of what people were actually trying to accomplish. And that's really why agents are so novel, as if you just think of them as a new generation of like process automation tools. it also means that they're a little bit, if you look at them as a software systems, they're a little bit less deterministic and, a little bit more trickier in terms of resilience and error handling and things like that. But yeah, that's really where people are going to start seeing the value, is being able to automate or use agents to help with situations that were sufficiently complex that previously we just largely couldn't use software with them.
And the main thing with those agents really is that you give it a goal, and you give it a set of rules in plain English, and you give it a set of tools and things it can do, tell it what its resources are, tell it what you want it to accomplish. And then from then on, you can give it, individual tasks based on its goals and the kind of thing that it does. And Pranjit's question, I think, is really clever. And here's what I think we've been doing as architects. I'll try to crystallize my perspective as of like 2025 up till now. What were we? We're these reactive beings, like dealing with change. And I think Gregor Hope said it best, like architects live in the first derivative, really is a mathematical way of saying that whenever there's change, you need an architect. But what we've been doing is we've been a reactive portion of that. Some good architects will put down what they're seeing downfield a little bit, but largely it's been a reactive system. Someone comes to you, they need something designed, you design it for them. You go in and you perform an architecture review after the fact of someone designing something or something about to go into production, and then you give them a set of notes of things to change. Largely, I think that this is the main point that will change. So going from being solution architects that design systems and respond to user requests, that's the piece I'm keying in there on, to being proactive, not just proactive, but predictive. I think that solution architects in the future, once we do apply agentic systems to our workloads, really get into a future where we can not just react, that's still going to be part of the game and being the translation layer between the human beings, what they want and how to get what they want. But being able to run multiple POCs of high value, being able to take the vision for where we could go and explore more space, more mental space, more of that future space of what is actually possible. And then take what we learn back and make better decisions, make decisions at a higher velocity. So I really think that going from being the reactive beast, that we are in this system, to being that proactive thing that we can be, is that bridge that I'd like to build with these agentic systems.
And let me ask you this then, or John and Randy, how do I learn? How do I improve myself? What should be my, almost like a sports person, what should be my day-to-day practice to learn, improve, get there, to be that type of architect in the future? Tell us all how to get there.
Well, broadly, there's two types of tools that anybody in a tech role is probably going to want to get proficient with. One is just some type of tool that helps you with general knowledge work. So, doing research, connecting to your data. So think of things like, in AWS, we have a new product called Quick that most of us are using now. And they, if you're a consumer, think of subscription to Claude AI or, ChatGPT or any of the other services. You're just going to want to get comfortable using those day to day. And once you get used to it, you won't stop. I don't even remember how many times I'm using these kinds of things on a daily basis. As a technologist, though, you are going to want to get familiar with how people are building with these tools. And so find and adopt, your favorite coding tool. There's many good ones on the market today, Claude Code, Cursor, Kiro, of course, QCLI, things like that. They have different styles. You find one you're comfortable with. But they really get good at it. So you kind of progress from using it as an assistant to using it as something that really helps you build from pretty early stage. And you will learn some lessons. It's much different to say, hey, I've got a piece of code, something's not working right, help me troubleshoot. That's pretty simple. But designing a new system from scratch is where you really figure out, how do I have to break this down into a series of discrete problems where the coding tool is going to be able to do a pretty good job of implementing it for me without me having to continually course correct it and do a lot of rework. So you will learn some practical lessons like that. So I would say just kind of force yourself to use it for a project that's pretty real for you. And then I do think there's some good ways to kind of tie yourself into what people in the community are talking about. I read There's a really good Substack called interconnects.ai. If you're interested more in like the science and what the frontier labs are doing, there's a great podcast called Latent Space that just summarizes, it always interviews people who work in Anthropic and OpenAI, and you kind of hear what they're talking about. And then, if you're interested more in like the kind of the mergers and acquisitions part of it, you can read the information that always talks to you about who's buying who and who's investing where and things like that.
At the end of the day, we're saying we need to get our hands dirty, right? Like there's no way around that practice anymore at this point. Like you need to go out there and it doesn't matter what you're going to try first and what kind of way you're going to do it, but you got to do that. That's pretty much what I'm hearing.
Yep.
Now, Randy, I've got to follow up on this one. Being able to take that to the practice. You spoke about doctors earlier, how you'd have that expert diagnosis that can come out of tooling, and how we're giving a critical eye to that. The practice of being an architect, how does that relate to the practice of being a doctor? They'll go into patient rooms over and over and over again. They don't necessarily get better from going into those patient rooms. They'll probably get better from their reading, their practice, the kinds of things they do. What's the equivalent on the SA side whenever we're talking about the practice?
Yeah, it's interesting because just to take a slight tangent, somebody did ask me a good question a few weeks ago, which is, well, if your theory is that we're going to need more senior software engineers in the future and less junior software engineers, how do we train people to become senior engineers? And I started thinking, well, how do engineers really learn like the hard lessons? Now, certainly you can get really good at writing complicated code. There's people that are expert at data structures and things like that. But if you look at how Amazon engineering teams work, I mean, they practice the real DevOps model. We don't have separate SRE teams. The people who write our systems operate the systems. They're on call. They're responding to the pager when something goes wrong, and they're troubleshooting. And I think that's probably where they learn a lot of the hard lessons about running big distributed systems, because they see when things break and then they figure out how to fix them. And I think as solution architects, the parallel I might draw is, fundamentally, we're talking about system design. It's not that any of us were necessarily the world's best, coders, but we kind of learned how to put systems together. And I would say like the parallel to like operating them is, well, let's build things that are a little bit more real, and then let's see whether they actually work. And so I don't know exactly where the line's going to stop, but I think we are going to have people in our role building things that are significantly closer to full-on systems than like the very simple kind of trivial demos we used to make in the past.
I like that. I like that a lot. So those concrete examples, that learning from the school of hard knocks is definitely one of them. No plan survives the first punch to the face, right? So there's a lot of those. I was thinking through all those scars that I got as a junior engineer whenever you were going through that. So my PTSD flashbacks happened for me.
Yeah. Well, I think we talk a lot about, when people ask about how our engineering teams work, we also talk about this correction of error practice we have. It's not just an engineering thing. It's used universally across Amazon. It's when something goes wrong, we want to learn from it, right? So we have this very formal process of, we really try to dig deep and find out what actually triggered this whole giant problem, or hopefully not giant problem, but so we dig a few layers deep, and then we think about, well, what could we have done differently? And it's not a blame process, right? I've sat in on some of those COE reads for fairly large, incidents, and it's always really focused on what can we learn. Maybe that's one thing we as solution architects, like it's a very solitary profession right now. Usually we're working with a customer and a salesperson and not with each other. Maybe we needed to get a little bit better about sharing learnings. Like if we build something and it really doesn't work the way we want it to, maybe we should do something like a COE and just kind of start sharing that knowledge.
So Randy, on this, just one more follow-up on this one. We talked about the practice here. We talked about, this getting into how do you make those juniors into seniors and how do they learn from this? But the question I have is really, how do we learn something that's never been seen before? Like we're getting brand new primitives that we have to build with, and there's not an existing pattern yet. It's a little bit different than some of these things that we've been building, like the 300 plus services. We have a little bit of those marks to earn our stripes. But then now we've got extremely different kinds of primitives, the agents, the MCPs, A2A, all of the things seem to have a brand new kind. It's like a brand new species. And we've got to learn the properties of how these work. It's almost like we're discovering something brand new. How do we work to be the architects that know how to confidently use these in the future?
I do think a lot of it is just recognizing where there's parallels to other patterns we've seen. So, one of my coworkers actually does a great job. He has a pretty strong, just large scale software engineering background.
Mm-hmm.
And he really has done a good job of saying, well, agentic systems, if you consider them as maybe just a new generation of distributed systems, there's some things that are different, right? We're going to use protocols like MCP and A2A to communicate rather than REST and GraphQL. But a lot of the overall system design questions about integration points, like, how do we test them for weird failure modes? How do we do resilience engineering? How do we load
put in observability? Yeah.
Yeah, like a lot of those concerns are the same. So I think what I've tried to do, like I've actually given several talks on resilience as it relates to Gen AI and agents. And it's really just about saying, like, let's find out what are the things that are really uniquely different. Like, agents, for example, tend to be more asynchronous because they have somewhat unpredictable latency. And so that impacts everything from chaos engineering to UX design. But I think we can draw a lot of parallels from past experience to apply here.
So know your fundamentals when it comes to those extant patterns. You'll be redeveloping them and reusing them.
Yeah, because fundamentally an agent, let's face it, the idea of a dedicated agent platform like Bedrock Agent Core is relatively new. What have people been doing up until now? They write an agent and they run it on Kubernetes or wherever they run their other software. So, in some sense, it is a different flavor of a distributed system, but it does have a lot of similarity too.
And circling back to one thing you said about this learning cycle, I think there's one thing that sometimes happens with our profession, especially for teams that are either greenfield or that has like a large amount of customers that are more low touch. We talk to customers sometimes, right? Like we even design something together, then they go build it, maybe sometimes with a partner, maybe sometimes on their own, but we never even hear from them again. Like that kind of breaks the feedback cycle a little bit, because I don't know if that design worked. I never hear back. And, I don't know if it doesn't work. I didn't hear the feedback of what didn't work and what I could have potentially have learned from that. So I don't know if it's a problem of how our teams are organized, and I obviously don't want to have an internal discussion on this public stream here, but what learnings are there that we can put out there for not just AWS, but everybody else about how we should try to organize our profession, and in a generic way, even if you want to answer that, but in a way that allows for this feedback cycle.
It's a hard problem because, I admit, some customers I worked with really closely and, was kind of involved and saw things really go into production and, get periodic updates on it every quarter for a couple of years, which is probably the ideal. But other cases is, you're involved, and then you kind of lose track of it for whatever reason. I think maybe we just have to think about how to solve this problem, because ideally the solution architect has an important role to play in helping design the system, but systems aren't stagnant, right? They evolve, we find problems with them. I think ideally, if we've earned a seat at the table on an ongoing basis, hopefully our customers will invite us back to participate in, well, how do we revamp this? And keep in mind, systems that use AI, there is one interesting thing about them in that, the models are, there's a new generation of models every 6 months. And most of the model providers are deprecating old models after like a year or 18 months. And sometimes that, that causes a lot of very public consternation. But, from an engineering perspective, it's like, well, hey, this system is very dynamic. It's like the really fundamental piece of it is changing every 6 months, every 6 to 12 months. And so maybe that'll be a driver to say, like, we do have to think more about the maintenance and operation of the system compared to the original design, and hopefully we'll have a role to play there.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that, but at the same time, I still think like for me to even have that opportunity, and I'm saying me as not me myself specifically, but like an architect, even to even have that opportunity, you would need to be either like an architect working on a project kind of thing. If it's a sales kind of position, which is very common, right? Like in cloud providers, in ISVs and things like that, they working with customers, and it's a changing landscape all the time. Customer accounts get redistributed when you change or things like that. Like you might just lose the whole feedback cycle, I guess is the unfortunate part of it.
I think there's one area where we've tried to do a better job of this, and maybe we can learn some lessons. In the whole resilience space, obviously when you're designing a new workload from scratch, you want to apply best practices so it's resilient and scales and all those things. But then, if there is some reason that for whatever reason, whether it's, AWS had an incident in an availability zone, or there's just a software defect, if a workload has unexpected and undesirable downtime, we've realized we really want to help customers solve that. And part of that is obviously our own services are trying to get more resilient all the time. We have things like Route 53 global application recovery controller for better failover routing and things like that. But part of it also, we have been trying to be more, I guess, persistent about like identifying and helping customers solve projected resilience challenges. And it's hard work, but maybe we need to double down on things like that.
Yeah, I like it.
I want to shift gears. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, John. No, please do.
If you got to follow up on this one, I want to go into the next one next. Yeah.
No, let's do it. Let's do it.
All right. So I was talking with a respected member of my team, and he was saying, "Hey, John, whenever you go talk to Randy, really talk about the revolution. We're not at evolution anymore with the role of the architect, and we currently treat SAs and senior SAs and principal SAs is largely interchangeable, right? With the way that we're assigned to go do this consultative work largely for customers so that they can, learn how to go imagine what's possible on AWS services. But this AI modification to what is possible is changing our role radically. And it doesn't feel like we're evolving into another thing. It feels like it's a full-on revolution. So what are your thoughts on where this revolution takes those differences between the different kinds of SAs?
Yeah, it probably has been a forcing function us to rethink. I talked a little bit about this. We have this vanilla idea of what an account team looks like. It's a salesperson in SA, and they cover one customer or a handful of customers, or maybe a lot of customers if you're in, like our small to medium business segment. But yeah, it's been a little bit of difficult actually, even internally for someone, they get promoted maybe from senior to principal, and it's like they're still doing the same job. And it's just, they have this vague expectation. Well, you're doing good things, go do a lot more of those, but you're fundamentally still have the same job. And so there's been a little bit of an urge to rethink, well, principal SAs and senior principals are our most, experienced, tenured technical staff. Maybe we should be looking at being more purposeful about what we ask them to do. And now in the area of AI, and this is just conjecture, so I think a lot of decisions haven't really been made yet, but maybe there is a school of thought that says, well, you have folks that are associate SAs or just the normal entry level SA, and they're pretty good technically. They know how to build. Maybe they lack some of the experience, and so maybe they can be almost like a forward deployed engineer model where they're going to be building really closely with the customer. They have access to more senior people if they need it, and then maybe our senior and principal SAs who do have that experience start to act more as the advisory. They're really helping a customer figure out tough, not just technical challenges, but like applying the technology into complex business domains. I mean, those are two of the fundamental things that I hope our SAs really do well is, build things and then help customers figure out how to apply them in a way that's meaningful. And that second thing probably does require a little bit more just the experience. So that's just one idea, but I think we're definitely having those discussions about, maybe we should be a little bit more purposeful about the way we employ some of our most experienced folks.
I hear you reflecting back a little bit of Pranjit's question there, right? So I heard that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like when you say like be more thoughtful about how we employ those resources. So are you alluding to like how we organize our teams, how we set goals? Like what is the component or the mechanism, to use, how we typically work in here, like that we should be tapping in here?
Yeah, I mean, some of it may literally be, right now, solution architects, we have a common role guideline. I think we expect additional scope and impact as you get further up the seniority levels. But yeah, maybe we say that there's certain things where we just have it's a slightly different job depending on whether you're an associate versus a principal SA. Um, it could be the team structures change. Certainly, I think the goals may change a little bit. A lot of the goals I think we had did reflect the fact that previously we were doing a lot of things like just basic education about how to use cloud well. And in the future, I think honestly, customers may not need as much of that from us, and so our goals are going to have to change to reflect that.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, we're coming up like almost closer to the end, and I want to, bring us to a conclusion if we can. So I'll ask you this, Randy. What would you say, if you could give, 3 pieces of advice for the architects, on AWS and out, or like out that are looking to join AWS perhaps, or even not, doesn't matter. Like, what would you say would be the most important piece of advice you would give for us going into the future now?
I think that the starting point, and probably just any knowledge worker, and like let alone in a technical role, is become AI enabled. Like figure out how to be really proficient with the tools that a lot of us are just taking for granted, whether it's your favorite coding tool, your favorite deep research tool. And you should just be really proficient and able to use those on a daily basis. That's kind of entry level, I think, or just table stakes right now. For solution architects, I think, honestly, just figure out what is it we're really here for, what is it we're supposed to be really good at. And to me, again, a lot of that is just building with enough technical credibility that we understand how things work together and we can offer meaningful advice to our customers. And so yeah, I would say start building more and more realistic and more complicated things as part of your daily routine. Now, some of that could be side projects, but think about it. Every time you work with a customer, personally, I've always found, the way I ideally work with a customer was first meeting, capture requirements, second meeting, come back with a solution proposal and cost estimate and things like that. And if it's like, yeah, that sounds about right, build a demo. And so, just do more of those things. And probably, I guess the third piece of advice is, alluding back to something John touched on earlier, really focus on what you're going to prioritize spending your time on. I think in the past, just at Amazon generally, in fact, I remember before I hired on, I read some stuff on LinkedIn about people who'd worked here, and they're like, there's just so many interesting things to work on. You can easily get spread too thin. And that problem is just going to continue to get exacerbated if there's so many interesting things to play with. So get really good about prioritizing your time and figuring out what are like the core things you really offer as a solution architect and get better at doing those.
Okay, I feel like I'll take control over what I, want to prioritize at this point. Like listen less to the noise, and this is what I want to spend my time on. John, your advice, go.
Oh, I love that. Get started with being AI enabled, get started building, and then really focus on the things that are important. And I think those things resonate with me, Randy. I'd say for each of us as architects, my piece of advice would be to pay attention to what your peers are doing. And so much of the AI work we're doing can be isolating. Don't let it. Instead, find your buddy that you really respect, grab her or him, and have a conversation and truly geek out about what they're doing. That's where you're going to be able to accelerate yourself the most, because they'll have gone down a different thinking track than you yourself have. For instance, I had a conversation with a brilliant architect last Friday, and he was showing me this multi-agentic system that he's got agents that are coding agents and testing agents and all of this stuff, to where he's able to just pop in and knock out a POC in 15, 20 minutes. And I was just like floored that he was able to do that with the tech. And I was just really inspired that people are already taking things this far. And it inspired me to want to go a little bit further. So I'd say grab a buddy for the ride and then buckle down and build stuff together.
I'll echo that. I mean, it's funny. A lot of our managers, and these are people who are, obviously have a tech background, but they've been people managers for a while. And some of them are running big departments, like they have busy jobs, and they're grabbing Kiro or Claude Code or whatever, and like cranking out their own agents to make sure they get reconnected to the tech. So, I think they're kind of raising the bar for all of us.
One more piece I'd say is this will go to leaders. I'm glad you mentioned leaders and execs and managers too, is that quality over quantity. Like these, there are a lot of things that you are going to need to focus on. So if you run a team of architects, if you are an architect on a team, and I brought up the team piece, really think about what Randy said about stopping those lower value, high volume type tasks. Think about handing those over, especially if they're repetitive, to a system that you can automate, to an agent, to something. And instead, make something that is really going to make you scratch your head. There's a new class of problems that are now open to us. We have new tools, which means new solutions are available. It means that the thing that's been on the top shelf that you've been afraid to reach for, you might be able to take it down and break it open and really find out the solution for that thing. So Rafael, I'll leave it to you. Give us the last word. What's your piece of advice that you give us as architects?
I know I like what you mentioned last there. Like, I think that's what's top of mind the most for me, John. I mean, I think we have been in a world where, we've been asked and we've been asking to do more. And I get that. That makes sense, right? Like, we want volume, we want that drives, results. But we're at a point where I think we have the tools to try and help us get to a point where we can push back. And I'm saying this from the perspective of individual contributor. Push back and try to focus on quality. If don't go for the quantity, it's not worth it, and it's not going to make a dent. And then also for the leaders, be very mindful how you're going to set goals for your team, because that's going to either drive them towards quantity or drive them towards quality. That's literally in your hands as you set goals. So try to be very mindful of that. And if you can, go for quality. That's what I would say, as the most important thing.
To sign us off here, I did want to go ahead and thank Randy so much. We really appreciate you for joining us on the AWS Pulse episode 3. I really enjoyed this conversation. This is one of my favorite topics. I want to thank my co-host, Rafael. Thanks for making this a reality, bringing this together. And thank you to everyone who's watched today. If you have questions to us, please feel free to reach out and have these conversations among your teams and among yourselves. Really excited to see what you come up with, what you dream up with, and we'll see you next time on the AWS Pulse.